Yes, started. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another predisability talk organized by the University of East Anglia. And today I have a pleasure to invite someone I met a few months ago in Prague at EVOP Congress. Our presenter today is Dr. Anne-Catherine Torka. Anna is a postdoctoral researcher at the Chair of Social Work and Organizational Psychology at TU Dortmund University. Her research focuses on open science in psychology, particularly in the field of work and organizational psychology. Anna is also interested in motivation in teamwork. Her work has been published in JOOP, European Journal of Work and Organizational Psychology, Advances and Practices in Psychological Science and Psychological Bulletin. And today, Anna is going to present her systematic review, which she co-authored with sorry, I can't remember the name of the professor. So it's on preregistration in industrial and organizational psychology. And Anna has just let me know that her paper has been submitted and accepted by JOOP, a journal of the Journal of Organizational and Occupational Psychology. So we're so very much looking forward to hearing from you. The stage is yours, Anna.
Thank you so much for the nice introduction. Okay, I hope you can see my slides now. Okay, great. First of all, thanks for having me. Today, I want to present you a study that I conducted with my supervisor, Joachim Hüffmeier, about pre-registration practices in industrial and organizational psychology. Together, we will look at how common pre-registrations are in IO psychology. We will look at how often researchers deviate from their pre-registered plans, whether these deviations are transparently reported or not, and also whether these deviations indicate that people might have used questionable research practices. So maybe you have already seen a published paper with one of these open science badges. So let me give you a real quick introduction in the what are pre-registrations and why should we do them. So if a researcher wants to do a pre-registration, it usually means that he or she registers their study plan online, including, for example, your hypotheses, your variables, or your analysis. And this is usually done before data collection. Usually because maybe you want to work with secondary data, then this is also possible. And then you just upload your pre-registration before you're looking at your collected data. Then you upload your document to one of the various platforms that are available, for example, the As Predicted or the OSF. And here your document will receive a timestamp. It can be shared also without revealing your name, which can be very important, for example, during the peer review process. And it can also be updated transparently. In the open science community, pre-registrations are perceived to be game changers because they can help to increase the transparency and also the rigor in scientific reporting. And researchers that have already done a pre-registration before also perceive it to improve the quality of their projects and of their research processes in general. Because if you want to do a pre-registration, you have to think about all details of your study beforehand, which usually helps to improve the quality of your own study. However, there is a study by Hartwicke and colleagues. They looked at 200, 500 randomly selected studies from psychology, and they found that only 3% of all of them had a pre-registration. So there were only very few pre-registered articles. And as I am affiliated with IO psychology, I was curious about the frequency of pre-registrations in IO psychology. So my first research question was how many published articles in IO psychology are actually pre-registered at this time. Further, I was interested in deviations from pre-registrations. Previous research from different disciplines already showed that deviations are quite common. So deviations means that people do not stick to the plans that they had originally pre-registered in their pre-registration. Depending on the field of research, from 2/3 to almost all published manuscripts do deviate from their pre-registered plans. For example, the study by Olmo Vandenacker looked at pre-registrations and compared these pre-registrations to the published articles, the corresponding published articles or manuscripts. And they found only a low consistency between pre-registrations and published articles. Similarly, if you look here and here, we can see that in gambling studies, but also in a sample from psychological science, we not only have low consistency between pre-registrations and articles, but these deviations are also often not disclosed. So people do not transparently report that they deviated from their pre-registration. And even from my own experience, I can tell you that in my own PhD thesis, I included 5 studies and I deviated in all of them. So deviating from pre-registration is really quite common. But I was interested in how many pre-registered studies in IO psychology deviate from their pre-registration and also in the amount of deviations without transparently reporting it. The study by Klaassen and colleagues included pre-registrations from one journal, from the journal Psychological Science, and they included pre-registrations only from the time point from 2015 to 2017. So this was the, if you were to say so, the first generation of pre-registrations. So pre-registrations were included in the top guidelines in 2015. So people who had already used pre-registrations in 2015, 16 or 17 might be kind of the early adopters. And if we assume that people will get better at things, if they have more routine and more experience with it, then it might be the case that people in this research field might become better at doing a pre-registration. For example, showing that there might be less undisclosed deviations in the journal Psychological Science than there might be in IO psychology today. Because in IO psychology, from my own experience, it's just the first steps. We are just the first people who are trying to do a pre-registration. It's not so common for, like example, for in social psychology. So my fourth research question was whether there are more undisclosed deviations in IO psychology than in currently published articles from psych science. Furthermore, I was interested in possible relationships between undisclosed deviations and questionable research practices. Because there are different types, different reasons of deviations, different reasons why people have to deviate from their pre-registration. For example, if you go to a conference and you learn about a new analysis that is better suited for your data, then it might be a good choice to deviate from your pre-registration, right? Or if you're doing studies in the lab, then there might be unforeseen circumstances. For example, you are not able to recruit as many participants as you had pre-registered, or if you're working with an organization, maybe you have to end data collection earlier because the organization tells you to end it. So those could be some possible reasons why people deviate from the pre-registration. Other reasons might be that we had a little error in our pre-registration because we are all just humans. But it might also be the case that you could deviate from your plan because you want to receive statistically significant results. So maybe you exclude some participants until you reach significance, or you change your hypothesis so it matches your data. So these examples would be questionable research practices. And I was interested whether the undisclosed deviations in particular are associated with questionable research practices, because if I want to use questionable research practices, then I might be more, it might be, I wouldn't disclose any deviations if they are due to questionable research practices. So this was our last research question in this project here. Okay, let's come to our method. We included in our sample all IO psychology journals from the ABS Academic Journal Guide. With some exclusions, we excluded all journals that did not publish in English or German, that only publishes theoretical contributions and without a focus on IO psychology. That leaves us with 27 journals that were included in our sample. In all of these 27 journals, we used the following search string to identify all pre-registered articles from IO psychology. So we searched for all studies or for all manuscripts that mentioned prereg or the OSF or the as predicted website or registered or a different kind of writing of pre-registration. And from all included pre-registered articles, we randomly draw 25 pre-registrations from IO psychology to code whether there were deviations. And we also draw a random sample from the journal Psychological Science to compare the two different research fields. And here the journals or the articles from Psychological Science were matched to our sample from IO psychology regarding the year of publication. So here you can see our flow chart. We identified with our search string more than 500 manuscripts that we had to screen. Not all of these manuscripts were included in our analysis because some of them were theory papers or editorials that just mention the act of the open science practice of doing a pre-registration. And we had to exclude many of these records here because they did not actually include a real pre-registration. They were just talking about pre-registrations, or many of these included studies about registered nurses, and we included the term registered in our search term, in our search string. So we also had here a lot of false positives. So we had to exclude them here. From all included studies that were pre-registered, we then randomly draw 25 and look whether we could code them or not. Then we were here at this step where we had to also exclude some of these pre-registrations due to 3 different reasons. One was our own manuscript, and it was not really a good idea to include our own study in our own paper in our study, because we had to count whether we stick to our plan, so it wouldn't be very objective. So we excluded our own manuscript, and we also adhered to the inclusion and exclusion criteria, like the study by Klaassen et al. And they had these two additional criteria: accessibility and minimal methodological detail. Accessibility means whether we can assess the pre-registration. So we needed to be sure that we were able to assess a pre-registration, that, for example, the link that was provided really had a pre-registration that we were able to assess and to open and to read, and to match with the manuscript that was published. Then, if the pre-registration was accessible, we also look whether it included at least some methodological details, so that we were able to compare the pre-registration with the same aspects as in the pre-registration and in the manuscript. So we also had to exclude, for example, manuscripts that only pre-registered a sample size, but none of their hypotheses and none of their analysis, because we were simply not able to compare the pre-registration with the manuscript then. Okay, after these exclusion criteria, we were able to include our 25 randomly drawn pre-registered articles from IO Psychology, and then we matched these ones to our sample from Psychological Science. So overall, we looked at 50 different manuscripts and pre-registrations. For all 25 IO Psychology pre-registrations and for all 25 pre-registrations from Psych Science, we coded 6 different aspects that you can see here. We looked at the hypotheses, at the sample size, the procedure that was described. We looked at all pre-registered variables and covariates, at exclusion criteria, and also the analysis. And for each of these 6 aspects, we coded whether there was a deviation. So we compared the pre-registration to the manuscript, coded whether there was a deviation, and for all deviation that we did found, we also coded whether the deviations were reported or not. This was quite a lot of work to compare all pre-registrations and manuscripts, and in some cases it was really hard to decide whether it was a deviation or not. For example, if you have pre-registered an exclusion criteria, but you do not mention this exclusion criteria in your manuscript, there might be 2 different reasons for that. So one reason might be that you do not say anything about this exclusion criteria because you simply had no people you had to exclude because of this criteria. So maybe you say, okay, I need to save some words. My manuscript is too long, and I can just, I do not need to include this exclusion criteria in my document. But maybe you also didn't report it because you deviated from your pre-registration. So there was some kind of subjectivity in our coding, and that's why we double coded all deviations with 2 different coders. And here we had some substantial reliability between our 2 coders. So, okay, let's look at our results. So, how many published articles in IO Psychology are actually pre-registered at this time point? So maybe you've already seen it in the flowchart, but we were able to find 91 articles that had a pre-registration in IO Psychology. these came from 13 different journals. And interestingly, more than half of these articles were published in only 2 different journals. Namely, the first one, the OBHDP, and the second one, the Journal of Applied Psychology, so JAP. Figure 2 provides an overview of the number of articles with pre-registrations in IO psychology per year. And as you can see, we have a slight increase in pre-registrations over years here. But if we look at the total number of pre-registrations, we still only have 91. That's not a lot. And if we look at the total number of articles that are or that were published in this time point, then we see a different picture. So only 0.7% of all articles that were published between 2016 and 2023 have a pre-registration in IO psychology. So you can barely see here the black line, the amount of pre-registered articles in all published articles. So doing a pre-registration in IO psychology is currently the exception, but not the rule. This table provides further insights into the distribution of pre-registrations across different study characteristics, such as study topic and type of study. Interestingly, most studies that are pre-registered are from organizational psychology and are online experiments. So as you can see here, we have some pre-registered surveys, experimental file studies, lab experiments, and meta-analysis, but most of all pre-registered studies were these ones, the online experiments. We identified 91 articles with a pre-registration that we were able to code for this step, for the study topic, but many of these articles were multi-study papers that included more than one study. That's why we were able to code 191 pre-registered studies. And here we found that most of them were online experiments. Okay. Then if we take a step back and look at this part here of our flowchart, then you can see that we had to also exclude some pre-registration based on accessibility and minimal detail. And to assess the quality of all pre-registrations in IO psychology, we rated this accessibility and minimal detail for all of our included 91 pre-registrations. So here we included only those that were randomly drawn, but we also wanted to provide these information for all 91 pre-registrations. So we also did that. And here are the results. 83 of all articles passed the accessibility criteria, and of all of these that passed this accessibility criteria, 66 also passed the minimal detail criteria. So overall, most pre-registrations in IO psychology are accessible and also report at least some methodological details. So that's quite good. Okay, for all 25 included manuscripts from IO and of course also from Psych Science, we then looked at the different aspects and coded whether they were or had a deviation and whether it was disclosed or not. So what you can see here is the 25 different articles that we looked at. And here you can see the different aspects. And then we coded for each aspect whether it was deviated, and whether it was disclosed or not. So this means that here the first manuscript included no deviations. So the researchers totally stick to their pre-registered plans. There was no deviation at all. In the second manuscript, we had an undisclosed deviation regarding the hypotheses or research questions and regarding the analysis. And furthermore, we also had a deviation that was transparently reported in the exclusion criteria, and so on for all of the 25 different articles. So overall, we had deviations. Most deviations were in the hypotheses and the procedure aspects. We had 10 deviations in the hypotheses and also 10 in the procedure. We had 8 deviations in the analysis, 7 in the variables and sample size, and only 4 deviations in the exclusion criteria. So, and with this coding, we were then able to answer all other research questions. However, before I move on, we also looked at possible correlations of the adherence and, for example, the impact factor of the journal, the number of included authors, the number of studies per article, so whether it was a multi-study paper or not, and also the publication year. But we found no correlations at all with any of these variables and the adherence to the pre-registration. So our second research question was how many pre-registered studies in IO psychology do deviate from their pre-registration? And our third was how many deviate from their pre-registration without reporting it? So here we found 72% of pre-registered articles in IO psychology to have at least one deviation. So it's quite common to deviate from your pre-registration. And we found that 68% had at least one deviation that was not reported in the associated manuscript. And these rates are slightly higher, but quite comparable to the sample from psychological science. Looking at research question 4, are there more undisclosed deviations in IO than in psych science? On average, there were 1.28 aspects with undisclosed deviations in IO psychology and 1.08 aspects with undisclosed deviations in psych science. So we can conclude that there was no difference in the amount of undisclosed deviations between these two fields of research. So our base factor here says that the data are approximately 9 times or even more than 9 times more likely under the null hypothesis that stated that there is no difference between the research fields than under the alternative hypothesis. So we assume that there is no difference in the amount of undisclosed deviations here. Looking at the last research question, we wanted to know whether the undisclosed deviations might be associated with questionable research practices. So if we look back, we coded here six different aspects from 25 different IO psychology papers. That means that we coded overall 150 aspects for the IO psychology sample. And from these 150 coded aspects, we found 46 deviations in total. From these 46 deviations, we had 32 that were undisclosed, so not reported in the document. And this was our sample that we wanted to look here at to answer research question 5. Most of these undisclosed deviations were, in our opinion, not associated with questionable research practices. So we had 26 undisclosed deviations and no questionable research practices. Again, it was quite hard here to decide whether a deviation could be, might be, should be interpreted as being associated with questionable research practices, because we searched for potential reasons why the researchers did deviate from their pre-registrations. But if people do not report it, they typically do not say anything about why they deviated. So it was quite hard to choose whether it was or could be associated with questionable research practices or not. So we based our coding here on whether it's reasonable choice to change your procedure or to change your sample size, whether it might be due to unforeseen circumstances, and that was the most important point, I guess, was to decide whether a deviation might have potential implications about your results, about how you would interpret your results, whether it could alter your findings, for example. And here we had we found that most of these undisclosed deviations might be due to learning, because people used in our opinion, better suited analysis, for example, or they just had a small error in the pre-registration where they just had some linguistic changes, where they just changed something in their hypotheses, but not the direction of their hypotheses, but only the wording, for example. So in these cases, we coded it as no association with questionable research practices. However, we also found 6 undisclosed deviations that might be associated with questionable research practices. In this 6 cases, we had 3 cases where the researchers changed the hypotheses. In one case, a part of the hypothesis was omitted, so they included only one part of their pre-registered hypothesis. In another case, they removed an entire hypothesis from their pre-registration to the manuscript. And in the last case, they mentioned a dependent variable in their pre-registration as being only supplementary, as being only exploratory. But in the manuscript, this supplementary dependent variable was introduced as testing a new hypothesis in the manuscript. So we coded these instances as could be associated with questionable research practices. Furthermore, we had 2 cases where the researchers omitted a predictor that was pre-registered. And the last case was quite interesting for me, because the researchers here excluded over a quarter of their data based on a manipulation check. So excluding people based on a manipulation check can be very useful and totally fine, but this manipulation check was not included in the pre-registration. It was not mentioned in the manuscript that they, for example, simply forgot to mention it in the pre-registration. And the most important point here is that we were able to reanalyze the data because we found the data set that was shared online. And when we reanalyzed the data, but included this amount of people that were excluded based on the manipulation check, and you can see over a quarter, it was quite a lot of people were excluded. And then we reanalyzed all of the data, but including the people based on the manipulation check. And then we found that the results of the paper were no longer significant without this exclusion. And there was not a single word mentioned about any of these deviations, not a single word mentioned about that the inclusion or exclusion of people based on the manipulation check had such a strong impact on the statistical significance. So we also coded this as a potential questionnaire research practice. To conclude, the articles in IO Psychology are currently not pre-registered. Most of them did not include a pre-registration, so it's only the exception, not the norm. And we also found that the journals seem to have quite a high impact on whether people do pre-register or send them a study that is pre-registered, because those journals that were included mostly in our sample were these journals that mention pre-registrations very prominently on their web pages. So OBHDP and JAP both say a lot of pre-registrations and even require people to give a statement whether they pre-registered the data or not on their home pages. So this speaks to the impact of journals. So there are not many people that do a pre-registration in IO Psychology, but those people who do seem to be just as good in doing a pre-registration as people from other fields. We learned this from the comparison between IO Psychology and the sample from psychological science. So it seems to be that doing a pre-registration might be very easy to learn, even if you're doing it as an early career researcher, for example, even if it's your first time or the second time that you do a pre-registration, it might be quite easy to learn. And there's also evidence from a survey from Spitzer and Müller about how easy it is to do a pre-registration. And furthermore, we found that the deviations in IO Psychology are likely not associated with questionable research practices. So that was a quite good finding. The last finding that I want to point out is that 2/3 of all pre-registrations did deviate from their pre-registered plan. So pre-registrations are a plan, not a prison. If you want to change anything, if you have to change anything, that's still possible. It's totally fine if we deviate, if we do it for the right reasons. So if we have unforeseen circumstances, or if we say, hey, I learned something new, I would like to change my manuscript based on what I learned, it's totally fine. We can all do that. But what is important is that we be transparent with our deviations. So there are two ways of being transparent with our deviations. The first one would be that we mention all deviations in our manuscript, or we could also include a template that is designed especially for sharing all of our deviations. I included here some resources for conducting pre-registrations that might maybe be helpful. For example, here are different forms, different templates for doing different kinds of pre-registrations. For example, also for meta-analysis or for systematic reviews. There are also templates for qualitative research. But here are also at the bottom of the table, here are also different templates that we could use to transparently report all deviations from our pre-registrations. So these two templates are quite new. And for example, I like the first one. It's from the last year. It's from Will, Rod, and Atherton. And here you can, first of all, include all deviations in the first part here. You can include all deviations from your pre-registration, where you first decide what kind of aspect it is about, so whether you had a change in your hypotheses or your exclusion criteria. Then you can select one of several reasons why you deviated here. And you can also select the timing. So when did you deviate? When did you make the decision to change your plan? Was it either before data collection, after pre-registration? Sure. But was it before you collected any data? Was it after you had already conducted some analysis? Or when during the research process did you decide to deviate? You can select it here. And then for all deviations, you have to fill out first the original wording. You can just copy paste your wording from your pre-registration here. Then you should provide a short description and justification of the deviation. And lastly, and this is, I guess, the most important point here, you should provide a description of whether and how the deviation should affect the reader's interpretation of the study and or the results. So did for example, the study where they excluded so many participants that their results became statistically significant? This would be here the point where you should mention that this had a huge impact on your results and on the interpretation of your results. So this is the first part of the table. And the second part here is for any unregistered steps. So any steps that you wanted to add after your pre-registration, where you do not have, in general, you do not have an original wording because you did not mention this step in your pre-registration. But here you can provide a description of what you added to your research. And again, how it impacts the reader and how it impacts your interpretation of the results. That's all from me for today. Thank you very much for having me and for your attention. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. And as Shavak already mentioned, our article is currently in press in the JUP. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna. And I'm really looking forward to. I really need to see the paper and spend some time with it. So
thank you.
I've prepared some questions, but while you were presenting the paper, I've also come up with a few others. So if you don't mind, I will just go ahead with my questions.
Sure.
First of all, being a human being, I'm very curious about if you disclose actually in your paper, if you disclose the journals which you have reviewed. And I was interested in the one case where data was excluded. So which particular journal was that?
I don't know it from my memory.
But you do disclose in paper, perhaps. So yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I was also
all deviations in our paper, all anonymized, but we included all our decisions and how we, on which reasons we based our decisions, whether it was or could be associated with questionable research practices or not. Yeah. So you could totally look it up in our paper.
Right. Okay, interesting. So yeah, I was thinking about the journal may not be even aware, maybe because the journal does not have this preregistration requirement, like as you said, many do not, so it's quite understandable. At the same time, we know that why researchers may feel under pressure to manipulate their data to meet the significance threshold. Yeah. Yeah, totally understandable. It's just, but I think the focus here, the emphasis here is on making our practices more open and transparent. Yeah, so that we don't have to manipulate with data.
Yeah.
and use any sort of techniques like p-hacking, for example. So it was interesting. So why did you focus on psychological science and not other journal for comparison?
Yeah, we focused on psychological science because there is already this paper by Claassen et al. And they included all papers from psychological science from 2014 to 2016, I guess. So it was the first generation of pre-registrations. And yeah, we were interested in this particular journal because it was kind of the first generation of pre-registrations. So we assume that they should have a lot of experience with pre-registrations. So it's I don't think that the people that were analyzed in the first paper by Claassen et al. Are the same authors that we analyzed, because there are not the same people who regularly publish articles in the same journal, right? But it was very comparable regarding the method, their study and our study. And we looked at the same journal because the people that are, for example, editors or that are in charge of the journal, maybe people who regularly do review for this journal, they might be still the same, or people who come after the first editor that was in charge during this time. People might have learned from the earlier people, and they might have learned how to give a good review regarding pre-registration. So they might be more in charge of, hey, you did a pre-registration, that's great, but maybe tell me about how you deviated. Or maybe they were more common to, or more regularly compared pre-registrations and the manuscript during the peer review process. So maybe they just had more experience.
Okay.
And we wanted to have a field that had more experience already compared to now.
Right. And in the paper, are you making any practical recommendations for journals, not for individuals?
Yeah. So I would say a journal could promote pre-registrations on their websites. So we saw that the top journals that were included, or where most pre-registrations came from, were those journals that prominently mention pre-registrations and also had some recommendations regarding pre-registrations also on their homepage. So it might be a good first step if a journal simply encourages. It shouldn't be the case that you say, hey, you have to You have to have a pre-registration to be able to submit your journal, your paper here. But even a slight word of encouragement could maybe make a difference. Or if we think about open science badges, it's a very simple and very not very costly measure that journals could include to provide an open science badge for all articles that have a pre-registration, just to support implementing pre-registrations more in their journals.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add to your point that some people may not even include it due to the word count limitations. So I was thinking that maybe journals could use it, could encourage this as this practice as an appendix, and make it more sort of add more structure, more homogeneous structure to it. For example, using one of the templates you demonstrated, because there's a number parent template for different type of studies. So yeah, so that, yeah, okay, interesting.
That would be great. And also more structure for reviewers would also be very great. So that if I'm doing a review and the journal says to me, hey, you have to compare this, you have to at least click on the link to the pre-registration and check whether there actually is a pre-registration. Because we also had instances where we clicked on the link and there was no document and we were not able to find any pre-registration. And this shouldn't be the case. So if you just check it during the peer review process, you should find that there is an error and you can say, hey, dear author, please provide the correct link to your pre-registration, because otherwise we were not able to see it and to compare it. So this could also be a nice addition and a simple addition for journals to give us as reviewers also some guidance on how we should treat people or manuscripts that include a pre-registration.
Yeah, it's interesting that people can claim it but actually not do it, and no one will check it.
Totally.
Okay, interesting. So, yeah, back to your point on so where there were instances when there was actually registration. So I'm curious about the technicalities, because it does sound like a lot of work. So did you actually have to check the content of the paper with the content of the pre-registration? Yeah, just okay.
Yeah. Oh. So the first difficulty was to match pre-registrations and papers, because as we saw, there were many multi-study papers. And if someone had a multi-study paper, it was usually the case that they pre-registered all studies, or at least more than one. Maybe they had a little pilot study that was not pre-registered, but then they had some experiments in the lab, 2 or 3, and they normally pre-registered all of them. But then it was the first difficulty to match these pre-registrations, because often people change the name of their study. So, for example, you pre-registered 5 studies, but in your paper you were only able to include 3 of them, for example. So then it was very hard to decide which pre-registration matches the corresponding article and the corresponding study. And after this first hurdle, we then had to look at the pre-registration. We saw a lot of variability in the length of pre-registrations and also the quality of pre-registrations. So in some cases, people just had the as predicted template and included only, for example, 1 page. They included only these are our hypotheses, and we did a G-power G-power calculation for our sample size, and we want to include 100 participants. And in other cases, the pre-registrations entailed much more details. So, for example, they did not only mention how big their sample size should be, but also all of the parameters that they included in their G-power analysis.
Right.
Or they made many more decisions about their analysis and provided more details. So that's where some subjectivity came from in our coding, because there were so many different types of pre-registrations. And yeah, of course, then we also had to look at each aspect from the pre-registration, look it up in the manuscript, and decide whether it was the same or whether there was a deviation.
Right. And it was interesting that online experiments, they seem to champion.
Yeah.
I was like, how did you interpret this in any way?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I guess it might be easier to do a pre-registration for an online experiment or also for a lab experiment, because you can plan everything ahead. So if I'm doing a survey on prolific, then I have to decide beforehand what I want to tell participants, what they have to see, how long they have to see each site, and so on. How many people should be included in this analysis. And it's quite easy to do a pre-registration for this kind of research. But it might be more difficult to do a pre-registration for example, qualitative work, because there you have so many decisions that you have to do changes during the research process. So it's not as easy to do a pre-registration for qualitative work as it is for a study in the lab or for a prolific study. Yeah. So that might be one reason.
Yeah, it's much more complicated. I will tell you more. It may be not even during the research process. It may be after a rejection. But
yeah, totally.
when you go back to your paper and start doing and review it through a different theoretical lens, for example, the same data. Interesting.
That's true.
But overall, I think it was interesting. Although it seemed that, again, my understanding of it, that the majority of deviations were undisclosed. But again, the majority of those undisclosed, they didn't seem to have anything with questionable research practices. So overall, there seems to be, and the percentage is still very small. It's 0.7%. But overall, there seems to be some development in the field.
Some increase, yeah.
Yeah, some positive development in the field, which is quite encouraging. And I think your work is so great to be able to capture this at this point and this progress. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, it was very interesting. Okay.
Yes.
It's been great to have you, Anna. Yeah, thank you very much for sharing your details as well. And I will be sharing this recording with our audience later. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. Let me just stop this. Oh, yay. Right. Okay.